Thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad you're spending your Monday morning and afternoon for some of us. I'm in Texas, so it is definitely afternoon here. So we're glad that you're spending your time with us. All right, welcome everyone to the University of Washington Smart Center's 2023 Virtual Speaker Series. First and foremost, the University of Washington Smart Center and Northwest MHTTC acknowledges that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us, and those who still walk here. We are grateful to aim to respectively live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. We encourage you to learn about the ancestral lands you are joining us from. I just realized I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Kleinita Graffin-Reed, and I am a Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator for the Smart Center. We are so pleased to present to you guys our 2023 speaker series that is focused on equity-centered MTSS and implications for school mental health. Our first session, we kicked that off, what is this? Was it March? Yes, we're in April with Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims. And today we have Tanara Blount and Tiana Bial, who will talk about their work out in the school district that they currently serve. We want to make sure that you know that this is being brought to you by the Northwest Mental Health Technologies Transfer Center, NWMHTTC, and the University of Washington School Mental Health Assessment, Research and Training Center, or UW Smart Center. And real quickly, just want to tell you a little bit about the UW Smart Center. Our overall mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students through research, training, technical assistance, and support to policy making. Role of the Smart Center. Well, we set the context by doing basic research on school mental health. We generate evidence by developing and testing models that work. We mobilize the evidence by providing research-based training and TA, conducting research on implementation and technical assistance strategies, and we build political will by disseminating information broadly and being at the table with funders and policymakers. We ask that you connect with us on our website, email, or social. And here are all of our handles for Twitter, email, and the internet. As part of the National MHTTC network, our Northwest School Mental Health Center supports the mental health workforce in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We invite you to reach out to us by connecting through email, social media, signing up for our listserv, or regularly visiting our website for new information posted weekly. And we can be found for our Northwest MHTTC. Here our handles, our internet address, our email, and do we have our Twitter? Yes, and our Twitter and Facebook. And without further ado, I am so pleased to present to you Ms. Tanara Blount and Tiana Bial, who are going to talk about doing the work, ensuring equity and cultural responsiveness and urban implementation within the MTSS framework. So pleased to have you guys with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanita. We're excited to be here. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. Again, my name is Tanara Blount. With me is Tiana Bial, and we are just super excited today to be able to talk to you from our perspective of what it's really like to do the work. And when we talk about doing the work, we're talking about ensuring that there's equity and that we're being culturally responsive when we talk about implementing MTSS frameworks. So again, thank you for being with us today. And of course, this is our session, Doing the Work. The objectives of what we're going to speak about today, we're going to start off by talking about what is equity, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what is MTSS. Next, we're going to lead into some cultural considerations, because this is what we have to focus on when we talk about what does it really look like to do the work. We have to get into the cultural considerations to make sure that we're being equitable. We're then going to talk a little bit about, now that we understand what we mean by equity, and we know you all know what that means and what is MTSS, we're then going to talk about what's needed, and that's a little perspective shift, a little mindset shift. And then we're going to share a couple nuggets of information on how we do the work to support educators and trying to shift more closer toward that mindset. So again, we say welcome in the most culturally responsive way that we know how. This is what we do. We would like to welcome you again to our session and thank you for being here with us today. So who are we? Tiana Bilal is my colleague who is going to be working with me today during this session. And I know Tiana was having some technical difficulties. I am not sure if her access has been granted. Tiana, are you still there? Awesome. So I'm going to pass it over to Tiana. She's still here, so she can tell you who she is.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having us. We are honored to be here today. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I cannot turn on my camera, but I am hoping to show you a little bit more about who I am through these slides. So who is Tiana Bilal? Tiana Bilal is a mama to 3 amazing children, ages 22, 12, and 4. I'm also a wife to Abdul, my loving husband. I'm a sister, a friend, and what I noticed during this compiling the pictures for this presentation is that I'm missing one of my closest friends in this picture. Tenora definitely belongs in the picture with my friends. And I am a true crime lover. If you give me A&E, Court TV, or ID channel, I am a happy lady. Tenora, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tiana. I'd love to. So who is Tenora Blount? Who is this woman, this other woman on here speaking with you today? Well, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. We like pictures, so following suit, I am a mom. I'm a mom to many. I have a wonderful blended family. You can see us there on the beach. That's who I am. First and foremost, I am a mom to my wonderful children, even my bonus children. I am a wife to my husband, Mike. Mike and I are happily married, going on 10 years. I'm expecting that ring upgrade next year. Happily married to my husband, Mike. I'm a friend. I'm all about my friends. Those are my besties. We've been friends since kindergarten. Now, I'm a Rocky connoisseur, folks. I'm from Philadelphia. Yes, I grew up watching Rocky. I love all things that is Rocky. I'm an alumni of Westchester University, where I received my bachelor's degree, St. Joseph's University for my master's degree. And this last slide really resonates with me because when I saw it, it speaks to who I am when it comes to my professional career. I don't like the word boss. I don't use that word. And the team that I work with, they oftentimes hear me say that. Don't call me that. I'm not the boss. I'm a leader because I believe there's a difference in being a boss and being a leader. So I pride myself professionally in being a leader. In the trenches with the team, we're working together to achieve that goal. So that's who I am. So we're going to start off today briefly talking about equity. I want to forewarn you, one thing you're going to notice. When we talk about doing the work, you're going to notice we're not going to get too technical today. You guys have been probably teched out. You know, everyone in here today is coming from so many different areas of the field. You've done a lot of this work. You've heard it before. We really want to get deep into talking about what it takes to do the work. But before we do, a couple things we have to still go over. So when we talk about equity, the most important message that we want to send home today is something that I'm sure that you all already know. Equal does not produce equity, right? You can look at this image. You guys have probably seen it before. These equity versus equality images that shows you where, yeah, we're all trying to look at this game. But when we talk about equity, equity doesn't mean giving everybody just the same thing and saying, hey, go, be great now. You all have the same thing. No, right? Because it's not enough. It wouldn't be enough to just give everybody the same thing because the way I may need to use that thing may differ from the way you use it. So it's important to start there and understand that we're not talking about being equal. So this is the reality of what we really have going on out here. As hard as we're working in the field to try to get closer to having equity, we still have this reality that we still have some young people out here not getting what they need to be successful. And that's where the work has to be done. And we have to shift our focus because we need to make sure that everyone has what they need in the way that it can be used for their purpose. That's how we'll start to close up that gap. So there's some barriers out there, right? When we understand, well, okay, so there's not enough equity in education. What's going on? It's these things here. And yes, it's like a rain cloud. It was raining earlier here today. We need to stop the rain from happening because our efforts, unfortunately, are still not really breaking through these barriers because these barriers are not going to cease to exist. Trauma is not going to go away. Poverty, access to things. There's that bias thing, right? Be it implicit or not. These things are not going to go away. And what else isn't going to go away are the mental health conditions that our young people face every single day. So if it isn't going to go away, we're from the PBIS side of life, right? We always talk about how PBIS is a framework. It's not a program, right? We're not trying to fit the round circle in that square. No, instead, we have to make the systems work so that people don't have to change who they are, especially when they can't. Okay, so these are some of the barriers that we all know that are out there. What are we going to do to try to break through these barriers to ensure that we have equity? Let's shift it to the classroom. Let's shift it to the schools. This is where we work. It's where I come from, right? I started off as a teacher. I've been in the classroom. I taught high school. God bless everyone who teaches K-8. I don't know how you do it. You all are superhumans. However, let's think of those behaviors, right? These are some of the common behaviors. I've seen them, right? That child that can't keep still, that aggression word. And I often hesitate to use even the word aggression because when we talk culturally, that word within itself can be used for harm to pinpoint people. But we see these behaviors where a young person is physically aggressive towards other people, towards property, disrespect. That's another ambiguous one, right? But all of these different behaviors are behaviors that we commonly see when we walk through schools. We may even see them when we're traveling to and from. I know I see it oftentimes when I'm out and about. And what happens is that when we look at that behavior, the biggest question is, what do you really see? What do we really see? What we see is we see that we have educators and people often get stuck on that tip of the iceberg. But I think we all know what really matters and it's what's behind it, what's really going on. And if we want to start figuring out ways to break through these barriers and to not allow the barriers to continue to have inequities within how we manage and use a framework to give our students what they really need, it requires us to stop and to pause and reflect on what it is that we're really looking at. Because what's really going on is the stuff that we can't see. So if we look at the behavior, we all know that we have to manage this behavior, right? No one's going to sit back and let certain behaviors just continue to happen. But the question is, how are we managing the behaviors? We call them behavior concern, okay? It's important to us to shift away from that criminal justice mindset of violations and offenses. These are not criminals. We're educating children and we're working with children. So we're talking about immediately starting to shift that perspective, that mindset, that language, being culturally responsive. These are behaviors that are a little concerning. So what do we do about them? I know I promise you wouldn't go too deep, just scratching the surface, nothing you haven't seen before. We all know about the ABC model. If you haven't, Ellis, 1979, it's the whole ABC. The concept is behavior just doesn't happen for no reason, right? There's that activating event or that antecedent. There's something that happens before the behavior actually takes place. And even with that behavior, there comes along this rational, irrational mindset, but then there's that consequence. And that's the world we live in, right? We're coming from the positive side. Again, our work is all about PBIS, but there can be negative consequences too. So we have to be mindful that when we think of how we're managing behaviors and what we're doing to try to move from these concerning behaviors, it comes into play again, but what do you see? What is the naked eye seeing? Because that's what's going to ultimately drive the decision on how we're going to manage that behavior. So what are we really looking for? I've been here before, I'll admit it. I've had to learn from my many, many years of experience in the classroom. But oftentimes what happens and what I see in my line of work when I used to be out there coaching and supporting schools, that teacher or that educator, that person that's doing the work, that's experiencing that behavior, they often go into how it impacted me. Wow, what does this behavior look like to me? This kid is so disrespectful. Or, man, I had this awesome lesson plan and now my lesson's all thrown off, or my anxiety is out the roof because this behavior has caused a change in my physiological state, right? It's all about me. Well, that's the problem. That's the problem. It shouldn't be all about me. I want you guys to take a look at this and you can drop in the chat, right? What do we really see? I'm sure you've probably seen this image before, but when you look at this image and you can drop in the chat, what do you see? We all may see two different things. I remember the first time I saw this, I said, I don't really know what I'm looking at. And it took some time for me to kind of step back and take a look. And then I said, oh, I see now. I see people dropping in. A woman with a hat. Someone said a young woman with a hat with a feather on it. Someone said a young lady and an old lady. We're all looking at the same image, but we see different things. Same here. What do you see here, right? All looking at the same image, but you'll see different things. And what we see ultimately is going to impact what we do. And we have to keep in mind, some say a rabbit, some may say a duck, right? Same thing here. This may look like a vase to me, or I may see two faces looking at one another. Two people said a duck in the chat, right? So we have to be mindful that when we start this, and when this entire process starts, before we can get into, is this child tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? What are we going to give them? What do they need? Can we stop and pause at what are we really looking at? And can we stop and think at what is it that we really actually see? Because I think this lets us see at the surface, we can all see different things right there, even before we get underneath that iceberg for what's really going on. So the bottom line is raw data is not enough, right? That first impression, that first thing you see, it isn't enough to just stop there. If we want to make sure that as we start to manage behavior, as we start to document and do things, we have to make sure that we're going down that equity route. So different methods of collecting it, right? We all know, we've been there, you've worked in schools. There are a number of different things that are in someone's playbook for managing behavior at the school level. Hopefully we have progressive discipline. We'll talk about that later. But there are a number of different things that we can do. But all of these methods, whether it's a conference with the student, to a detention, to some type of suspension, which we never recommend, a restorative practice, period, whatever it is, all of these methods of behavior management have one thing in common, and that is we want to make sure that we're using those things to collect data. We use all of those things to start to document what it is that we see. But documenting is only the first step. Because as I mentioned before, we're seeing different things. That tip of the iceberg, what's really beneath, we must disaggregate the data. The raw data alone is not enough. First and foremost, we have to disaggregate the data. What are we really looking at? Not only must we disaggregate that data, we have to understand and make sure the reason that we're collecting that data is it's right. It's not to be punitive, it's not to bring about harm, but it's really to do something. And then we have to use that data in a way to make sure that we're really getting students what they need. So there's this tiers, we've talked about it, that triangle's coming. I didn't want to put it here just yet. But then we use all of this data. Once we can really disaggregate the data, to really know what it is that we're really looking at, to really factor what's beneath that iceberg, that's when we start to talk about these levels of support of what students need. And these systems, they have to talk to each other. So I'm going to get ready to pass it over to Tiana, because she's going to start to talk to us about those 1, 2, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, MTSS, and what it really is as we start to focus and really zone in on how we use this framework to ensure we have equity and that we're being culturally responsive. Tiana?
Thank you, Tanara. So as Tanara mentioned, we didn't want to, but there are some pieces that we do have to. When we start to talk about MTSS, I want you to keep in mind that MTSS is the umbrella term that describes an approach that addresses academics, behavior, social, emotional needs of all students. We want to keep in mind that it's important to consider the whole child when you're addressing student needs. Tanara, can you advance to the next slide? The MTSS framework helps to provide the overall structure for school mental health supports. It ensures that students can access a continuum of services at various tiers, as Tanara mentioned, tiers 1, 2, and 3. It's an approach that addresses academic, behavioral, and emotional needs of all students. It facilitates collaboration between all stakeholders, including students, family members, and community members. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further along in the presentation. And it utilizes database decision-making to help align supports for students. So in using MTSS to identify supports, MTSS uses tiered interventions, database decision-making, and progress monitoring. Using the MTSS framework helps to integrate multiple initiatives that schools have in place. It helps to strategize resources and identify staff who can be trained to collaborate and utilize evidence-based interventions at each tier. At the tier 1 level, we see some of those more universal supports, including the use of maybe school-wide norms. As I mentioned, as Tanara mentioned, that we come from the world of PBIS. You may see some of those evidence-based SEL practices and those more mental health-based supports put in place to help make everyone aware of what mental health is and what it looks like. We have something called Youth Mental Health First Aid, which everyone may be aware of.
Following up with that, the next component Tiana just referenced, we have our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, from our school-wide all the way to individualized supports at the tier 3 level. The next component that's important within TSS is that database decision-making, right? So remember, when I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the data, we have to disaggregate that data first and foremost. I cannot say that enough. We can't look on the surface and see. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with school teams and they'll say, oh God, 8th grade is just out of control. And I'll say, really? Show me the data to see that. And then you look at 8th grade and figure out they technically have about 5 high flyers who are really accounting for most of the activity, right? So you have to disaggregate the data. You have to make sure there's no disparities in that data so that you know what you're looking at before you make these decisions. So the analyses of these different data sources, we have to take, again, Tiana mentioned the whole child, right? You have to factor in everything from behavior to attendance to grades, screenings, everything. And then you want to align that to the supports and the services that they need. You're not going to have outcomes that are desired if you're not following the data and the right data. So when we get into ensuring that this MTS framework is working in a way to truly support the whole child, again, mindset, what are we really looking at? What do we really see? What's really there? So there's also the progress monitoring aspect. So once we analyze the data, we look at the data, we've factored everything that we see from disparity all the way through to what the real issues are, what the real problem is at hand. We now have to set some goals as we progress monitoring, and we want SMART goals, right? We've heard that before: specific, measurable, attainable, right? We need to make sure there's SMART goals. And then we have to plan that strategy that we're going to use in order to intervene to get the child what they really need. Gathering all of the data, progress monitoring it. But that MTSS team is important. Who's doing this work, right? We need some administrative support and we need strong administrative support. But more importantly, You need that broad representation when we talk about the stakeholders. In our PBIS world, we say in a heartbeat, if the team does not mirror the demographics of the students, you don't have a team. Okay, well, you need the perspective, not just from administrators. You don't need a siloed group, but that MTSS team should be a broad representation. And you notice who else is listed here, guys? Student, family, community. Who else can better really keep us informed about the whole child than the stakeholders that come from the same place? The student themselves, the family, the community. And then that team has to be culturally diverse, right? It just has to be. I don't like to sit down with the team and then I see situations where I'm like, well, we have people at the table that look nothing like the people in the school. So where's the perspective really coming from? Is there an understanding? So those cultural considerations that we're talking about, we have to make sure that we are specifically taking into account the values and the norms that represent the community that we're serving. Oftentimes, when we look at interventions and we look at these different tiered levels of supports, we can't just think that something that's going to work in one area or something you learned working over here is going to fit into the box of the community that you're in. It may be foreign to them. I have a wonderful story. I'll never forget. I had a time where I had a school, they wrote a student up because the student told the teacher, "You're always on my top." And the teacher took that to mean something sexually explicit. And when someone else that looks like the child at the school looked at this, they said, "Wait a minute, what did you think the child meant?" Whereas in that child's culture, it was a norm to say, "On my top" means you're pressuring me. You're constantly applying pressure. You're constantly digging into what I'm doing and what I say in a way that makes me feel that I can't do anything right. It had nothing to do with something inappropriate, right? But this is why we have to factor in and understand the community in which we're serving. This is why that MTSS team, it's crucial that we have these cultural considerations. And when we talk about them, we talk about it all: age, gender, ability, economic status, everything. We have to make sure to serve that we're servicing a community that we understand. But most importantly, we seek to understand the community if we're going to do the work. So all hands need to be on deck. All stakeholders involved, from the school staff all the way again to those community partners. We need to make sure everyone has an opportunity to help us truly, again, what do we see? We need to see the whole child. We need to see the whole situation. We need to see every single piece of data that speaks to really telling us who that child is, not just the behavior that warranted us to sit at a table as a team and have a meeting to figure out which tier this child should be placed. So when we talk about the school staff, again, who should be on this team, getting us the data, partnering and providing with those services, helping to drive all of those decisions. When we talk about the student, oh my goodness, they give so much feedback. Sometimes I oftentimes say, have you ever just stopped to talk to the student? Do you ever just stop to get their input and their feedback to understand from their perspective what's really going on? Let them help with the implementation of the plan, right? It's important because they have a voice. They should have a voice. And then the family giving us that outlook that we don't see and we may not know. Because we all know children can show up and show us one side, but again, that iceberg, there's always more. So using the family, getting the family involved, encouraging them to help and work. And guess what? Bring some of that stuff at home. Try to bridge the gap between home and school. Connecting the two to ensure that we're speaking the same language, that these norms are understood. Looking at what the norms are at home and adapting what that looks like. How can that align with what we're doing in school so that this child can understand? We never have a right to tell them what they were taught or what they're doing is wrong. What we can do is say we respect what you do at home. We want you to respect how our community in here is doing things. But most importantly, we want their voice and their input on what that school community should look like. And our community partners, again, helping us get the services we need within the schools, having that constant link, having that flow, you know, and we talk about a village, right? It takes a village. That village is important because they bring so much information and they can bring in additional supports that we don't think about. oftentimes we have people that work at a school that aren't from that community, right? So there's constant pieces that can be brought in from all of these other stakeholders that we definitely want to factor, and we want to make sure all hands are on deck. Why? We need to shift some perspectives, okay? So we said before, we see behaviors on surface and we see the behavior, it's not enough. Because if we get stuck on what it is that we only see, then what's mattering is just what's on the surface. But what we really need to factor in is what's beneath. What are we really looking at? How do we shift the perspective? First and foremost, we need to educate educators beyond academics. Educating educators beyond the academics. All educators, I'm one of them. We went to school, we've practiced, we've done our due diligence in the field, and we've done our practice teaching, and we took the classes, and we have our degrees, and we have our certifications. We've done all of that. We have the academic knowledge that we need to bestow all of this education amongst young people, but it isn't enough. It isn't enough that that's all that we get. We have to make sure that we're supporting educators beyond what it is that we want them to teach other young people. So what do we mean here? Can we start with youth mental health education and awareness? I remember being a classroom teacher, and I remember sitting in trainings and learning certain things. And there are even things that I learned when I was in theory in school that when it came time to application, it looks a little different, right? It looks a little different when my personal stuff comes into play. It looks a little different when behaviors have now caused something within me. Remember a few slides back in the beginning, we talked about the concept of all about me and all about how this makes me feel. We need to make sure that there's education in youth mental health awareness, and we're going to get into why. Also, PD alone is not enough. Nothing against professional development. I think it's great. I think we need it, right? Some people will probably get credit for being here today. We definitely need it, but it can't stop there, okay? And then most importantly, grace and space. And I can't wait to talk about that. I scream it from the rooftops all the time. There needs to be grace and space, right? So let's talk about it. A little bit of more technical stuff, nothing you haven't seen. Take a look at these numbers, and this spells it out. We need to make sure that our educators are aware of mental health in our young people. We need to make sure they're aware. They need to understand. These are the things that our students are dealing with. There are diagnoses in our students. 1 in 6 American children aged 6 to 17 experiencing a mental health disorder each year, right? If we look at the percentage of children, while the percentages may be low, look at approximately how many that is when we look at this across the United States. And so first and foremost, it has to be understood there's more behind this behavior. It's not just on the surface. And so the perfect starting point is making sure that this information is shared and that our educators can understand who is the population that we're really dealing with. And most importantly, look at that, 50 to 80% of our school-age children not even receiving the mental health care that they need. So this training is important. Why? It's all connected. If I don't understand the why, if I don't understand what's behind the behavior, my response to the behavior is going to lead to some of the inequities we see in education. It's going to help to build a bigger gap and to restrict access to children that maybe did not receive the proper response of what they needed. Why? Because someone wasn't aware enough, or someone got into their own feelings, right? Something was documented for this reason other than that. So understanding that there's a connection and that the impact that these things have on the other peers, understanding that it's treatable. Our children are not lost. It is treatable, right? Keeping these environments conducive for learning. Ultimately, that's why they're there in the first place. But also, educators, we can't forget about making sure that they can protect their own. I'll never forget, I had to do a youth mental health first aid training. And hadn't done that kind of work in a while, and I hadn't had to sit through it in a while. And halfway through, it began to trigger me. It triggered the mom in me. It triggered every human side of me. But there are things that we walk into the classroom and into schools every day as educators, but we have our own stuff too. So we oftentimes have to also be mindful that this kind of training can also help with our own mental health. You know what they say when you're on the airplane, you have to put your mask on first, right? Because you can't help someone else. All of it comes into play because it's important. All of these things factor in to make sure that we're being equitable and that we're being culturally responsive when we talk about these targeted tiers of support and everything that falls under that MTSS umbrella that Tiana mentioned, when we're looking at the whole child, not a piece of a child, not a part of a child, but the whole child. We have to make sure we educate our educators beyond academics. You heard me say professional development alone, it's not enough, because it's not. It's not. There are a number of different things that we have to also consider when we talk about delivering professional development. The platform alone is enough. We could stop and we can go on for a while there. Virtual, the pandemic has shifted everyone's mindset. We've shifted to a virtual platform where we've realized, we don't have to bring everyone together. We can still do this. We can do it virtually. Let's talk about equity. Everything doesn't work for everybody. This platform alone may not be equitable for some individuals who need more than just this to grasp. I'm a kinesthetic learner, so I'm very touchy-feely. You could sit me in a room with the same amount of people and give us the exact same information, but I need a little bit more for me to retain it, right? So you have to think about the platform. I just talked about the triggers, taking care of ourselves, right? Thinking about what could trigger an audience, right? Think about the interest. Are these people interested? They should be. Doesn't mean they necessarily always are, right? But you have to think about that. That whole being voluntold to do something, that has an impact itself. And then the follow-up, right? You do these wonderful, awesome PDs, and then that's it. It's just left out there in PD land. There has to be proper follow-up, right? Something has to be done after the PD. We can't just drop it there and leave it. And then the frequency, right? Are we doing overkill? Is it too much PD? Is it not enough PD? What's really needed to make sure that the ultimate purpose of our professional development, we're reaching our goal that we're trying to hit? So just a few things to consider there, because again, it's not enough. And then grace and space. Most people don't like to hear this one, but if we're going to talk about the whole child being at the forefront and ensuring that in our MTSS frameworks and how we're providing interventions to young people, that we are doing it with a culturally responsive lens and equity in mind, we have to keep the whole child at the forefront of every single decision that's made. How do you do that? Man, I tell people children aren't really that difficult, because guess what? They can sniff out authenticity, right? They know when something's real. They know when something's real. So it's about building those authentic relationships, and they have to be maintained too. Because a child, they're not going to want to hear, they're not going to want to listen if the time isn't put in to make sure that something is established and built with them, right? And then also knowing when to tap out. You have to know when to tap out, right? I may not have the same relationship that someone else and one of my colleagues may have with the peer, but it may be in the best interest of that whole child in that moment for the sake of providing interventions that they need for them to be safe and successful and well, for me to tap out, not just for myself, but for the child. Or sometimes it might have to be for me. Because remember, we talked about those triggers, right? I have to know how to take care of me too, that oxygen mask, right? And then those progressive discipline policies. I like to mention progressive discipline and grace and space, because what happens, we had to document because we have to get documentation in, because we have to substantiate and justify the placement of this child to get this service. I get that. And I understand that. But it's sometimes is that used as an excuse because we're tired of the behaviors that we see, because we haven't taken the time to truly understand what's beneath the behavior. We haven't taken the time to truly jump into the antecedent and pay attention to what happened before this behavior was displayed. So are we giving grace and space? One of the biggest frustrations for me is for school to start September 6th. And by September 15th, we have 20 to 30 referrals in the system. What? In what world does that make sense? Where's the grace and space? Are we really understanding the whole child? Do we have to do this right now? So all of these things have to be factored in when we talk about utilizing these frameworks to ensure that we're being equitable. We have to factor it all in. So not only is it important, and not only do we want to stop and think about giving the educators more of what they need beyond academics to ensure that they can educate young people, it's about making sure that we give them what they need, those people that are all hands on deck on the teams, to understand that our teams are doing the work to ensure that the interventions within this framework are equitable and that we're being culturally responsive. But it's also making sure that we have to support our educators along the way, right? How do we do that? So when we talk about supporting our educators, these are just a few things that come to mind that we focus on a lot when we talk about doing the work. We need that feedback. We need the feedback. But not only do you want to solicit it, then use it. Here comes that data again, right? To support it. And then there's a modeling and coaching piece. So supporting our educators is super important, because when people don't feel supported, it impacts the outcomes of what they do. And how can we expect to have educators being equitable, wanting to be culturally responsive when working within these frameworks, wanting to make sure that students are being looked at as a whole child if they're not getting what they need? We're kind of talking out of both sides there, right? So when we talk about soliciting feedback, we need to ask all those questions. I think the most obnoxious thing we could ever do is sit back and assume we know what people need. I don't know, right? Again, the shift of the mindset. I may be able to think I know what you need, but the only way I'm really going to know is to ask, right? So it's asking them, hey, what do you need? What's working? What didn't work? But we can't live in the world of complaining. It's great to get that. This didn't work. This did work. This didn't work. This didn't work. But now let's shift to ask for some solutions too. Because when we give them an opportunity to not only share what didn't work and sharing what's needed, it's also helpful for buy-in to now say, so what are some of the things then from your perspective that we can do to make this better, right? So asking, and then also asking for solutions to fix it. And in doing so, again, there's always things to consider, right? We keep talking about consider this, consider that. There are other things to consider too with feedback, because we know everybody's mindset on feedback is different, right? You might have that person living over here in that excellent, I'm good world, where you might be annoying me, asking me for feedback. Everything's great. What do you mean? I'm oblivious to it. Or this feedback it's mandatory, right? So thinking about when is the right time, how often should we get this feedback? Again, how should we ask for the feedback, right? Making it optional versus this is a requirement, you have to do this. It kind of changes the dynamic a bit. And then making sure it's realistic. We have to make sure that we're being realistic when we are thinking about the whole concept of getting feedback, and then feasible, right? We have to be realistic in considering, well, what is it exactly that we're asking for? Are we asking for something that we're not going to be able to deliver? So why even open up that box, right? Is it something feasible? So you can't think of being a support to educators and ensuring that they're being equitable in doing this work if we're not asking what they need. We've done work before, and I've been in situations where I found what they needed was to, guess what? Even really understand what it meant to even be culturally responsive, right? We're living in a time because the world has turned upside down, and let's be clear, a lot of this stuff isn't new, right? Access to education, these inequities that are there, all of this stuff has been systemic. It's been around. I remember I sat in on Dr. Nicole's series last month, and she did a wonderful job. And she shared with us, those of you that were there, she shared with us the timeline, right, of the systemic things that have happened that led us to where we are today. So we have to be mindful that we have to give people an opportunity to let us know what they need, because we might be surprised to find they need to understand the work that they're doing, not just the work that they're doing, but what needs to be done to make sure that the work that they're doing is giving us the equitable outcomes that we want. So when we get this feedback, that's great, but it isn't enough to just collect the feedback and then have it sit. You ever take a survey or someone asks for your feedback and you feel like you've given a lot of great feedback and then you just kind of never hear anything else again? And it's like, well, I took the time to share and I don't see anything happening. I haven't heard anything else, right? We need to acknowledge that we received that feedback, but we need to use it. We need to use the feedback. It is important to take the feedback and actually consider it. Just like we don't want to just document behaviors just to be documenting. We all know writing a referral for a student does nothing except allow us to collect data. What really does the work is putting in the time, attention, the grace, the space, everything that's needed to truly work with the child to give them what they need to help them improve, right? So it's the same thing here with feedback. Acknowledge the receipt of the feedback and then using that feedback. Acknowledging when feedback can't be used and why, right? But taking the stuff that we get and then applying it to the future plans that we're putting in place, and then actually doing something about it, because that's when people start to see, oh, okay, I do want to dive in deeper to this work. I see the what's in it for me. I understand and I can clearly see how when we do this, it doesn't lead to this outcome. Our outcome should be that every student has what they need to succeed, to be successful. Our outcome should be, whether students at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, any interventions, all stakeholders, everyone involved doing the work is doing the work with equity lens, is doing the work to ensure that they're factoring in the whole child. But I, as the person doing the work, understand what that looks like. I understand what it means. Oh, and not only did I get feedback when I didn't understand, but because my feedback was used, it helped me get to a place to do the work and do the work in a better way, because we're taking action. So when we talk about using the data, again, applying that disaggregated data, right? We should never just willy-nilly do something just because. I mentioned before, the worst thing that I used to hate seeing is, wow, I went to so-and-so school and that school's on fire. And I'm a data person. So my next question is, show me the data, to show me what's going on in here. Like, I want to know, I want to see, right? But again, not just looking at the surface data, digging deep and analyzing it, right? So that we can figure out where we need to go and what supports are needed. But all of the decisions that were made are made off of the data. Not making decisions because I'm annoyed that this child keeps interrupting my class. Not making a decision because it made me feel some type of way because I've been impacted. Not making a decision because somebody just told me I better do something about it. So now I feel like I have to put something in place just because I can check a box. But making those decisions based on what the data shows so that I can make sure that my outcomes are aligning when I look at that data again, right? Looking at that data and acknowledging the disparity in the data, that's a key indicator that we're not being culturally responsive. Whenever we see disparity in data, we can't ignore it. Speaking to it, understanding it, trying to understand why it's there, and then doing something about it. And definitely not using the data for harm. When I mention not using the data for harm, it's because oftentimes we'll have schools that decide that they're afraid to even share the data because it's going to have Big Brother watching and we're going to be penalized because of our negative outcomes. My response to that is, how do I know what help to provide if I don't have data to show me where there's a problem, right? So all of these components come together and they come into play to help figure out what are we doing and how is it that we're going to support the people doing the work. And another piece to that is modeling and coaching, right? I saw this quote and I loved it. Maximizing a person's potential, right, for their performance, right? Helping rather than trying to just show them, right? It doesn't help to do things for people. But if you can demonstrate, sometimes people may need to know the how. They may need to see it, right? Having that partner that you can pair up and say, hey, let me run this past you. This is what I got from that. What did you get from this? How do you read into that situation? And then filling in the gaps where they're needed. Again, making sure that support is there. Modeling, coaching, doing what has to be done to provide the support. Because without the support, it becomes virtually impossible for the work to get done. Again, if we don't know what it is that's needed. So it is 3:00, and that is pretty much what we have for you guys today. When we think about being culturally responsive, when we think about equity, when we think about doing the work, it is about making sure that first and foremost, we understand what equity is. It is not just giving everybody the same thing. Instead, it's giving everyone what they need individually to be successful with the same field that they have in front of them, right? And then when we look at our students and we look at the whole child, when we look at implementing through our MTSS framework, it's about making sure that we're being culturally responsible and we're keeping equity at the forefront of that. And in doing that work, giving our educators what they need, making sure that our educators are not being stuck in the academia world, but now we're changing with times. We're acknowledging what the data shows us about where our students are with regards to their mental health needs, and we're educating educators about it, making sure that they have not only the information they need, but what they need to go out and carry forth and do the work, and then supporting them on the back end.
Thank you guys for a wonderful presentation. There's so many things that jump out to me. You said I'm a data person. I too am a data geek because it's all in the numbers. It really is. And so I can look and think many years ago, I would never thought I would say I'm a data geek, but I am, because the data and PBS, we know that the data guides our decision making. So it's so very important. The other thing that was so on point, Tanara, was having to educate educators. And I know, coming from as a school psychologist, I had to learn about instruction. I always use a story that my background is behavior, but in order to work as a team to help children be successful in schools, I had to make it my business to learn about instructional strategies, because that impacts the child as well. And so we're all in it learning new things, but it really is, can I use a cliche? Teamwork makes the dream work. And so when we are all on the same page, working together with the goal of improving student outcomes, then that's what's the most important thing. So I just want to thank you for that. And I know that others probably found your presentation to be helpful as we talk about being culturally responsive and integrating equity into all that we do. So Tanara, you mentioned, yes, we do have some Q&A. And we'll just start at the top. We had someone who said, this information falls right in place with the way children's mental health system is supposed to work. For example, student voice, family voice, community members being a part of the team, monitoring progress, outcome-based, team-based, etc. I wish schools and mental health folks worked more together. Yes, 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 and then more yes. And that's really, Stephanie, that's what we talk about in terms of interconnected systems framework. Having all the school folks, which means we are all aligned, our behavior folks, our mental health folks, our our teachers, we're all on one accord. And then we bring in the outside mental health person to support our efforts. Absolutely. That is, I don't even think it's pie in the sky. We know that interconnected systems framework says that we can do these kind of things.
Yes, and can I chime in and say something else about that? I love this comment where Stephanie's saying, I wish schools and mental health folks worked more together. I can only speak from my experience, and what I see is people oftentimes get stuck in their lane of work, right? So I'm an educator, that's my lane, that's what I'm here to do. That's the counselor's job to deal with that part, right? And so again, that's that shift in mindset where we have to have our educators understand you're absolutely correct. It is your job to teach them, but in teaching them, we have to teach the whole child. And you can't teach the whole child if we don't have that connection when we talk about mental health when it comes into play. And so I think absolutely, I wish the same thing, but that's why in doing the work, that's what we strive to bring home. Definitely.
Yes. And Stephanie said, thank you so much. Great info put in a way that makes sense. And so I'm going to skip down to Andrea's question. She said, for many, data means strictly academic, looking at test scores, grades. How do you address that in a school culture that ends up overlooking whole child practices?
Using the data, right? And so I love this one. I love when that comes up, right? Because oftentimes I'll say, that's why we have to look at the data. So if you shift back and you see, well, we have our academic outcomes are not getting achieved, I'm going to come back and look at that classroom. Because when you look at the classroom and you say, well, if you're not factoring what the children's needs are beyond the academic piece, how can you possibly give them anything academically? And if someone can tell me how to make that make sense, then I'm a believer, but you can't, right? You simply can't. You just can't. And so it's a matter of continuously using that data. We lead everything with data, and that's how we do the work. Let's look at the data here. Let's look at the academic outcomes, but let's also look at the behavior component. It makes no sense not to think of the two together as one, right?
Absolutely. And they really are interrelated. And I think that's one thing as educators, we strive to break down the silos so that we can make sure that we're meeting children's needs. There is a question from Kyle, a comment, to integrate PBIS and MTSS more comprehensively. What are your thoughts on the MTSS model more overtly calling out tier 2 and tier 2 interventions that target enrichment interventions or supports? It seems MTSS tends historically to have a deficit focus, moving up based on greater academic needs or behavioral health needs due to a deficit in skill or knowledge. For example, a tier 2 targeted enrichment intervention supports will call out small groups of student leaders, for example, GSA, Hope Squad, things like that, working on promoting a positive school climate. Or tier 3 intensive enrichment interventions and supports would be one-on-one mentoring that focuses on students that are already thriving and maintaining thriving. Thoughts?
My thoughts on that are, that's a great question. It's a great point. Now, while I live more in the tier 1 world, however, when we talk about MTSS, we talk about we have to hold each tier accountable, right? You have to have each tier look at the data. And that is why we have to make sure we talked about systems talking to one another. They have to talk to one another, right? Because if you look at the question here about PBIS can be utilized at tier 1, tier 2. We know that PBIS isn't just at the tier 1 level. And so when you do that, and we're talking about things that are already thriving in other areas, and we're talking about, well, at tier 2, we're doing this, at tier 3, we're doing this. Tier 1, we talk about the whole child. It's important because I think oftentimes the misconception becomes PBIS doesn't work because we have, these things that still happen. It's truly understanding though what we're saying, because at tier 1, it's 80%. So we do have to consider the other 20% that are going to need more things, right? But those systems still have to speak to one another. And we still have to make sure that we're not omitting those things at the tier 1 level to allow students at tier 2, tier 3, something to kind of look forward to try to reach that goal as well, to try to get there.
And I think at tier 1 is where we are trying to continue to help children thrive. So we know that at tier 1, we're meeting all those needs. 80 to 90% of those kids we would hope would be thriving. Those kids who need additional support. So sometimes I think people overlook tier 1. Tier 1 is the foundation. We want to make sure that that is the area that we do prevention. And by preventing deficits, we're going to make sure that we continue those kids who are doing well both academically and behaviorally, they continue to thrive. Another question came in. Could someone expand on the use of street data in the MTSS framework and in consideration of the whole child?
This is, oh my gosh, I wish I knew where this person was from. So, so street data is so funny. I wish Tiana's could talk and be on here, but this is something that's actually on our plate that we're dealing with now, right? And so if you're going to ask Tanara, what I'm going to say about that street data and MTSS and the whole child, that street data is important. But again, I have to say it. And I think someone said this in the chat. When we talk about data, because I'm a data person, oftentimes people take data and align it with thinking that we're not looking at the whole child, right? Which is why I can't stress enough the importance of disaggregating that data to make sure we know what we're really looking at. When we talk about that street data, those are the other components. That street data is giving us more context to the bigger picture. It's helping to fill in the gaps of what's happening in that environment, in that space, regardless of the tier of work and intervention that we're trying to apply, to make sure that we're factoring in these other things. Again, I go back to the iceberg, right? We're in the process now of making sure we do that street data collection and frequently enough, because it helps give more context to the data that you're looking at. So to me, the use of that data is helping fill in gaps. It's helping us see beyond just what's on the surface. Because oftentimes I'll hear of something that happened and I'll have to say, I need you to back up. What happened before and then what was going on historically, what's happening in that space? What does it look like on it? Because to me, that's the street data. That's more than just that one specific thing that happened. It's filling in gaps and it's giving context.
I have a comment from Joan saying, thank you. This has been informative and applicable. I particularly appreciate the points about educating and supporting the educator to address their well-being. So I'm so glad that we had so much feedback, that folks are taking advantage of the Q&A time and putting in the questions for you. Do we have any? We have a time for maybe one or two more questions. If you have a question, go ahead and put that in the Q&A, and then we'll come back to it real quickly before we end. Again, I want to thank you guys for joining us. I know a few people are probably popping off. We hope you'll join us again for our next and final presentation on May 22nd with Dr. Eddie Fergus. And we all want to just let Tiana know, if you could just drop her a little note saying we all have had technical difficulties, and it's certainly nothing that is within our control when they decide to just shut the power down in your location. And so we just want to show some love to Tiana and know thank you for preparing for the session with Tanara. And we all have been there when it comes to technology. Again, thank you for being here. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next time. And note real quick, SAMHSA sponsors this work, but does not reflect any official position on this content. And in case you want to see it one more time, this is how you can get in contact with us. Our UW Smart Center email, our Twitter address, some QR codes, and our MHTTC information as well. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you guys in May 22nd with Dr. Eddie Fergus. Until then, what is today? Today's Monday. Have a great rest of your week.